Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of FireDEV, a fireside chat with people in the industry. Today, my guest is Kaleb Nekumanesh. Kaleb, how you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. I mean, thanks for coming on. You know, looking at your LinkedIn, you've been at a lot of amazing companies. We'll dive into them. Free for free industries, which is Halo. Amazon. A bunch of others as well. And like one of the on your LinkedIn, one of the taglines that you've got or subtitles or subheadings is shipped free AAA titles. I mean, to be part of any, I would say, product that's shipped is impressive in itself. Then to be, if you're in the gaming industry, to be part of a AAA title is even more impressive. And then you've been part of free AAA ship titles. Do you want to, first of all, talk about what those titles are, and actually even before that, what you do within the gaming industry?
Yeah, sure. And thank you so much. Yeah, so I started um I've kind of had multiple roles going into the game industry. Um I started off I actually didn't start doing games. I started doing film and graphic design as a contractor. And after a while I thought that there was a good time to move. So I transitioned over to being a QA person, quality assurance, and basically what they do is, test products, test games. Um, I started out at Microsoft. One of the first things that I did testing on was the Xbox. I believe it was the Xbox Series, not the Series, the Xbox One X. Uh, that one. um,
It's
I,
confusing then, eh?
yeah.
Yeah, it literally is at a point where you got Xbox 360, then the one consoles, and there's not just one X, there's one S. So you got to call it the
Oh,
one series. We can't even call it one series because they got the series consoles now, the Series X and Series S. Whereas with PlayStation, it's just, yeah, PS3 comes after PS2, 4 comes after 3. It's like there's no ambiguity there.
yeah, I never really understood that, but I mean, that wasn't my job to know why they
No.
called it those things. It was so confusing. But yeah, that was actually the first one. I was working on the team that did backwards compatibility, um, and just making sure that um, older games would work on the Xbox Series. Not sorry, the Xbox One X. uh, yeah, so that was where I started. Eventually, I worked at places like Oculus, um, for Facebook, um, and during my time there, I thought it was okay. Well, I want to kind of make the jump to games. Uh, I basically worked on my portfolio and my resume, not my resume, but my portfolio. I beefed it up during my time at Oculus, and then uh, once I had a portfolio that I felt was good enough, I sent it out to as many recruiters as I could, and eventually got my first job at 343 Industries as a world designer. Um, and at 343 Industries, my task was working on Halo Infinite as focusing on the open world. The terrain, the objectives, and the things that the player does from point A to point B as they explore the open world. Um, and I was there for quite a while before I moved on to uh, finding what I believe is kind of my passion, which is environment art. And I did that at Amazon Games for a game called New World. It was an MMORPG game, and I did. Uh, After a while there, I also worked at Ascendant Studios uh, as an environment artist, a senior environment artist. Um, and yeah, ever since we shipped Immortals of Aveum, which is the game at Ascendant Studios, I've been doing contracts and freelance work for uh, many other smaller games as an environment artist as well, or independent games as well.
Okay. And how did you get your job at, Oculus, which is obviously now Meta Quest, well, a Meta Rift, if they're still doing the Rift as well, or Quest mainly now?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what they would call it now, but yeah, that was the way that I got that work. Is I had a background at Microsoft doing testing, and um, I also had a technical background. while I also do creative things, I also have experience, you know, coding. I wouldn't call it coding. Actually, I'd call it scripting, just because I'm not very good when it comes to like systems level stuff. I think maybe lower level stuff is what they would call it. Uh, I'm mostly on like, you know, scripting gameplay mechanic, or like not mechanics, but gameplay scenarios. So I've done a lot of coding in Unreal and Unity, um, and even just from a sorry, my cat's crying. Uh, and also just doing coding on the side, learning about scripting and such stuff like that. Um, and then eventually, since I had the background at Microsoft, I saw that they were hiring. I didn't know it was for Oculus at the time, but I reached out to a recruiter who was hiring, you know, a QA person, um, and yeah, I just used my background in scripting, and my background in, you know, making uh, my own games, and my background at Microsoft to kind of get in. And then they had like a little questionnaire that they give you, um, and then yeah, that was my journey to that.
Okay. And previous to all of that, and even previous to Microsoft, what was your academic background, if any? Like, how did you like get into that? You know.
Yeah, so after graduating high school, I didn't really go to college after that for a while. Um, I just did freelance work, and eventually, I'm from Fresno, California, and it's mid to Southern California, and um, I eventually moved over to Washington to study at DigiPen. My thought process was, and what I've been always told is, you need to go to school in order to have any sort of job that's worth anything, which is my belief at the time. So I was like, okay, well, if I want to be in the game industry, I need to go to school. I went to DigiPen. I took out massive loans. That school's very expensive, um, and basically tried to figure out, this is try to get my degree so that I can get into the game industry. Um, but after a year, it wasn't quite working for me. It was really expensive, and living in an expensive uh, city, um, it wasn't very sustainable for me, and I had to drop out to basically just work and try to get money back. And that was the most terrifying thing for me, is like, I am now a college dropout, and I am the thing that I've been told is the most horrifying thing if you want to have a meaningful job that pays decently well. And that was my belief at the time, and I was like, oh my god, I'm I'm not going to have a job that you know will be able to sustain me and will make me happy. uh, so I just took any job I could, and that started out with being in QA, which at the time I was like really happy about. It didn't pay very well, but it was doing something that I thought was enjoyable. um, but going back to that, it was a scary time. I didn't know if I was ever going to be in the game industry, because I'm now a college dropout. um, and then later I realized, after getting my first job, uh, no one really cares. No one looks at your educational background when they hire you for the first time, or any time. What matters is the portfolio. What matters is, um, experience. Yes, is unfortunately a very big requirement for a lot of places, but more so than that is your portfolio. And when I realized that, I was like, okay, well, uh, I'm not so worried about dropping out of school now. Now what I'm worried about is, spending all of my free time making you know, a great portfolio, the best portfolio that I could. And that's what I did, outside of working at Oculus and Microsoft. You know, by day I was working there, and by night I was uh, building levels and building environments.
Okay. And yeah, I've come across a lot of people that have gone into the gaming industry via something like QA or even like HR or recruiting, and then they become,
Mm.
artists or programmers or technical guys, or etc. So something from that. So obviously anyone listening, just because you might not have the academic background, which 100% doesn't matter, it can help, but if you're willing to put the work into it, maybe create a portfolio if it's auto programming based, and try a slightly different role, something that a bit easier to get into, something like QA possibly, or HR recruiting. And then once you're in that company, like if you show obviously you got to get the balance between being overbearing and then but and actually having an interest in it. But if you show that interest, then when you once you get comfortable with it, you've been there for a little while. Again, it's not something that you can say a month later, I want a programming job. And I've been programming side. But if you're there for a year or two, maybe even less, but then you can just mention someone that you find that there and trust, be like, this is what I want to do. This is what I've been working on. Are there any positions available, and how can I make myself more employable in you? Because part of hiring, and I think you agree with me, on this, is part of hiring someone for a company is two things. One, can they do the actual task? So if it's an artist, can they do, create the artwork? And with that comes, do they know how to use certain tools? Do they know how to draw? If that's really what it entails. But then also, will they make a good employee within our company? And the second one is always hugely unknown. Like, that's probably the hardest one to figure out. Culture fit, as it gets thrown around in the tech world these days. You don't really know that until you hire. You could hire somebody who's very competent at what they're doing, but they just might not be the best fit for that particular company. Whereas if you're already there, like you was as a tester, as a QA guy, and if you've been there for a year, like, they know that you're, you know, culturally you fit in. Then it's a matter of the skills, and they're like, okay, you're interested. They'll be open to it.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the company, and that's when like researching the company becomes incredibly useful.
Yeah.
Um, there's a lot of QA, for instance, that is kind of considered outsourced QA, which even though if you work in the building of QA, you're working for another company,
Yes.
there could be, there is a real problem of, I don't know what you would call it, but I guess maybe classism. I don't know. Specifically, you're a QA. There are some people who believe that QA are not able to kind of move up from that point. It's kind of unfortunate. But if you do your research into the company, you realize, am I embedded into the you know into the development team, or am I in my own little corner? And I think that there's a lot of studios that are quite not open, but if you research them, you'll find a lot of people being open about whether or not the QA department is actually embedded. And in that scenario, you'll see, through the culture of the company and through actually working with them, you'll see that you'll be able to grow inside of that company. Um, but also another consideration is that, finding your first QA job doesn't need to be your last, right? One of the
Mm.
things in tech in particular, and I guess this also depends on, if the person wants to be, you know, when you think about what you want out of a job, do you want stability or do you want to make a lot of money? Do you want to grow in the role? All of these things, does it matter your title? All of these things matter differently depending on the person. And I think that if you're wanting to grow quickly in a company, starting from QA, and then growing into being, you know, a junior environment artist, let's say, and then being a environment artist and senior, and doing that process really quickly. An open secret is that you want to kind of switch jobs very often, right? It's not as stable, but you basically get the ability to have so many different jobs on your resume, and also, have experience with different types of pipelines, um, more so than if you stayed with one company. So it really just kind of depends on what you're looking for out of a company, and then researching that company and saying, okay, well, what is the best way for me um, to kind of grow in a role? And the reason why I bring that up is I know a lot of people who, you know, who started in QA. and then grew to being, a lead, very, very quickly because they kind of did this jumping between roles and they were, really wanting to kind of grow into their role. But I also equally know a few people who started in QA around the same time and are still in QA. Um, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. QA is a great place to be, but it's really seeing it as a jumping off point, I think is kind of counterintuitive to what QA can be. QA is a really great role that's really necessary in game development. Um, and it provides a lot of opportunities for growth. Uh, but depending on what you're wanting, but depending on what you're planning on getting out of it, uh, researching the company and figuring out how they kind of do promotions, how do they do integration into teams, is really important to learn about.
Oh yeah, and I think that's an interesting point that you made, that in QA and some of the other, areas of a company that might be considered lower, you know, yes, initially the entry level jobs in terms of pay and in terms of, let's say, status or position may not be that high, but then if you're at a big company, being the head of QA probably holds a fair bit of weight. If you're shipping a
Mhm.
product like Halo, for example, which you did work on, QA is a hugely important part of it. So yes, the initial, the lower barrier jobs in QA may not be that, exciting from the remuneration and the status side of it. But then you could literally get to the top of QA, and that could be very, very exciting. And then beyond that, really, in anything, you get into management, and when you get into management, or when you see managers, you see that they come from all walks of life. They'll come from a technical background. They come from more of like an artist background. They'll sometimes come from like a legal background, even though they may not be in the legal side of the company. They'll come from, a humanities background, like all sorts of stuff. They've just got usually really good, uh, and to the top of their core thing, and now they're just in management. So you could literally get to the top of QA and then jump into management. Then once you're in management at Free for Free or Amazon, then the QA part doesn't even matter. It's insignificant, and at that point you are above programmers and artists, unless they get into lead roles and manager roles.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's also just like, um, I think what makes a good manager isn't, I mean, a lot of places don't see it this way, but in my view, what makes a good manager isn't necessarily that you're the best at something, but you're the best at encouraging others to be the best at something. You're the best at um, encouraging people who are better than you to do really good work. And that's what makes a great manager, I believe, rather than being the best at something. Because being a manager, you're not really gonna say, for instance, if you're a lead environment artist or something like that, you're not going to be doing a lot of environment art. It's really more managing a team of really good environment artists, and your role is more so people management. And uh, once you kind of get to that spot, you kind of have a choice of, do you want to be like a principal where you're doing more um, very, very complex and large tasks, or do you want to be a manager as a lead, and basically help people do amazing work.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The higher you go, manager and beyond, and then into like executives and C-suite and advisory and like board member, like all that sort of stuff. Depends on the size of the company and the company itself. But like
Of
when you go
course.
into those roles, it is like you said about getting the most out of the people that are there, structuring the teams, and the people in the most effective and efficient way. Like, and then also if you're part of the hiring process, hiring the correct people, because when you're a mid-level developer, you're not really exposed to the hiring process. You may end up being on a call where you're asking some questions for a manager or a HR guy, and they're running, but the reality is by that stage that's probably second or first stage interview, and really it is just a matter of running the person past you as a developer just to make sure, be like, are they actually technically capable, or as an artist, or do they really know what they're talking about? But in terms of a person, the decision probably being made, or like almost being made, and you're just almost signing off on it, adding your little perspective. So yeah, a manager definitely isn't about, oh, I'm the best artist. But what I will add is, eh, because you get a lot of managers and people that are higher up that aren't very good, or they don't know, let's say, the technical side of it, and especially if they've never done it, that can almost, I feel like, in a lot of people that aren't managers, give them the false belief that if they're a very technical person, or very artist based person, very deep into one of these fields, they can't. I've heard it, like, they can't, become a manager, or they're just not equipped for it, because that's not what they're seeing. What I see is the best managers are the ones that usually were those things. So like the people, like the best managers that are organizing the development team and managing the dev team, are the ones that were devs themselves. At some point, it might have been 20 years ago, but like they know what's realistic and what's not realistic. They know how to push the team because they've been pushed, and they know what it feels like, but also where the barriers realistically are, versus just getting some random manager who's been in the league, or been in law, and yet knows how to manage people, but has no clue about the technical side, and now they're having to manage 10 programmers or 10 artists. So again,
Yeah.
I would love to your opinion, Caleb, on that.
Yeah, I think it is true because, like, if you're hiring a lead environment artist and you hire someone who's never done environment art before, that could lead to some issues. But at the very least, the important thing is that you find somebody who has done the work before, um, and and uh, and can and is very good people person, I think, and able to uh, have a team get behind them and listen to their team. Like, the most important thing for a manager to do, in my opinion, is to make sure their team is heard. When the environment art team gets a task that is monumental, the ability to break that task down into a bunch of smaller tasks that you can give to your team and delegate it to the rest of your team, trust the team will get it done, and also trust the team to be able to communicate with you, be like, oh well, you know listen to them say, oh well, this is going to take me this many weeks, or this is a large task, can we get more people on this, or maybe we look into areas to cut down. The lead environment artist should listen, or any lead should listen and be like, oh, okay, I understand. you know I may not know the technical, like, a lead environment artist may need to listen to a technical artist and say, you know I don't know what you do, I don't know how you do it, but I know kind of a general idea of what you're doing. I can um, listen to your advice, I can listen to your feedback and turn it into um, actionable work, um, and be able to communicate that with the rest of the team, right? Because the lead needs to be a great communicator, and if they need to be able to understand the needs of your team and communicate that to the rest of the team.
Oh yeah, 100%. And the communication is very very important. Knowing
Mhm.
one, how to communicate, but then also understanding that, okay, if you got 5 people on your team, they probably take communication differently. Like there'll be a one way of communicating with person A versus person B versus C, D, and E, to get them the best
Mhm.
value out of them. Because I feel like the poor, like the bad managers, are the ones that communicate the same with the entire team. Obviously sometimes it is, you'll just send out a general message to the team. Not saying every single time each email, each message, each word has to be tailored for each individual member of the team. But if you are trying to get the most out of them, and you're spending potentially a lot of time with them, or let's say working with them, then yeah, like, understand, okay, one person might respond better if you're a bit more aggressive with them. One might need a lighter touch. And I feel like that's something that a lot of managers do lack. And I think that's very difficult to be able to switch that, between different people, and also the environment. I think then on top of that, a good manager will also know that, okay, at the start of a project where the deadlines aren't looming, person A will react different to person B versus when the deadlines are looming as well. And then like it really becomes very complicated for a manager to do really well to know, okay, this is how I'm gonna push these people, and this is how I'm gonna push back if there's something that I feel like is going wrong.
Yeah, for sure. And that's very much what I do when I'm leading a team is basically identifying the team's strengths. Because everyone has, strengths and weaknesses, and it's your job to make sure that you delegate properly and you give proper direction and feedback in a way that is both, empathetic, but also is understood and reciprocated. Um, so, that's something that I think is very important is to kind of identify, when you talk, when you build your team or when you are integrated into your team, understanding, the particular needs and the different personalities of your team. What are they like? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What do they prefer? Um, because you need this team to get behind you, and you need this team to be on your side because you need to be able to trust them and for them to trust you back because game development is very difficult and getting and if the team doesn't believe you're competent, they won't be on your side, and it'll make your job much more difficult. Um, so that is very much the process that I take is identifying, when I first meet the team, identifying, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, what do they like, what do they dislike, um, and what is their preferred management style, in different types of stressful and non-stressful scenarios. Um, and then of course changing the management style depending on uh, the particular needs. And on top of that, if I get a bunch of tasks that need to be done, being able to delegate it to people uh, who both enjoy the work that you're giving them and can do it the most effectively. Some people may be really good at terrain, while some people might be good at making buildings. So, when you are delegating tasks, you don't want to give the person who's good at terrain tasks that are focused on buildings when you have a perfectly good terrain focused task you can give them. So uh, you just kind of want to give them things that allow them to shine, but also gives them creative challenges. Another thing that I find pretty universal for artists is um, they don't like to be bogged down with boring work that doesn't creatively challenge them.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that also depends on the person. So that's another thing that I would look into, when joining a team. But, you know, generally I've found that people really enjoy being creatively challenged. So, giving them a unique challenge that allows them to have a very big impact on the game, I think is always really rewarding for an artist.
Oh yeah, definitely knowing what type of, obviously just within like the artist space, what type of, task to give someone, and at what point as well. Again, like there's some, artists or some people, if you give them a task last minute, and there's a bit of pressure, that might be fine. But then vice versa, there might be someone that might not do so well in that environment, and it's very easy for a manager to sell it to themselves and be like, oh, they should just be able to cope. And it's like, okay, you could help them develop into a person that could manage stressful situations better and then work under stress better. But just by saying, I'm just going to give it to them, even though I've got, John here who can allocate, who realistically could allocate some time to this task. He'll do an amazing job under the pressure versus Bob, who I know won't, and I'm basically just gonna make him do it because I've got the power to make him. And again, that's the other thing. Managers, because they have that power, a lot of managers can, abuse it. And again, it's not just about being mean, it's just about, like I said, just allocating tasks in a way that's, you know, sensible. It's like if your manager, emails you at 4:45 and you're wrapping up at 5 o'clock with some big task, even if they don't expect you to do it that day. I still think that's a very bad move on the manager, because it's like, okay, write the email up and just schedule it for 9 a.m. in the morning or 10 a.m. in the morning. Like, unless it's
Mhm.
something that you need them to jump on straight away, and then ideally you're remunerating them for overtime as well. If that's not the case, why are you emailing someone at 4:45? Again, it just comes down to that. It's an asshole move, and you can schedule it. It's not like, oh, if you don't write it now, you're gonna forget. You're writing, you just schedule it.
Yeah, my favorite thing is when a boss says, you know, join this meeting with me, or hey, we need to meet in an hour, and doesn't specify why. You know, when you were something else that managers don't think about very often, at least in my experience, is the impact of their words on the people who are, reporting to them. Because a boss saying, hey, we need to talk about something, and doesn't specify, there's a million and one things going through my head of like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh,
And
am
it's
I getting
usually
fired?
bad. You're
Yeah.
not thinking that he's pulling me aside for 10 minutes to, compliment me on the environment that I just worked on last week. Even if that might, I doubt is the case. It usually never is. They're not, most managers don't just nicely take 5-10 minutes out of their week to be like, you did a really good job. Really appreciate it. Just wanted to, show you how much, and then wrap the call. Like, has that ever happened to you?
Oh, what has happened to me was I was told exactly what I was that example of like, oh, you know, uh, we need to talk on Monday, and it's Friday night, and
Oh,
it's
the
like,
all
okay, well,
weekend you're just thinking about it.
yeah, it's like, oh no, am I fired? I was like, oh
Yeah,
well, maybe I'm not fired because they would have just fired me, but oh no, what if I was?
yeah.
That uncertainty
Oh, it's a
is
warning
stressful.
where it's like it's not fireable, but you're getting there.
Yeah. Um, and I think that that's something that you always want to. It's just something that I don't think managers get, have on top of their heads. Because what it was, oh, he wanted me to do a task, and it's like, oh, there's this problem with the game, and we want you to help solve it. It's like, oh, I've been great. I could have thought about it all weekend. That would have been
Mm,
much more exciting to think about, other than, oh no, what do you want to tell me? What bad news do you have for me? There's a lot of there's a lot of things that can kind of go wrong just through communication. So I think a lot of it just comes down to communication, as we've
yeah.
it's so important.
I mean, I was just thinking now. It, it, it's like something out of a movie, I would say. But what a manager should do is when they message you, they should have free flags, and it's like not to worry, fine, like neutral, and then shit your pants. Like what I'm about to tell you, or the meeting that's coming up, you need to worry about that one. You need to stress about it. Maybe if there's always a flag like that, it's just like tick, everything's fine. It's just all rose. It's just business as usual. The neutral is just like, we don't know. We're just trying to figure things out. Then it's just like, oh, you're gonna get fired, basically.
Yeah, prepare for it. And I get
Yeah.
that, you don't. I've heard scenarios where you don't want to like warn them about getting fired and such, but I think that that's always super important. It's not, you want to kind of be communicative, or else you're just going to create a culture of being scared of leadership, which is never a good thing.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is what again I've seen this before, the way a manager will they won't be happy with something, but they won't tell you until it's too late. It's and their excuse will be then they're not there to micromanage you, but their job is to let you know when you are going in the right or wrong direction. So if they're not happy with the quality of your work, or you're focusing too much on this particular area, and let's say you're you know they tell you after 3 months, but they could see that after 2 weeks, but they don't raise it until 3 months later, and then they fire you, for example, or they heavily punish you. There's nothing you, as an employee, can really do about it, but that is on the managers, to basically be like, okay, I'm not happy with something here. One, is this person you know, uh, you know, could they potentially change? Are they good enough? And like, or have I just messed up on the hiring or whoever hired them? Or because if it is a matter of they probably could potentially be okay. Let them know. That's far better for you to pull them aside, be like 2 weeks in, be like, we're not happy with this, this, and this. We still think you have a potential future at the company, and this is what we need to see from you over the next 2 weeks. Let's revisit it instead of waiting 3 months and then just getting rid of the person, or 6 months or 12 months.
Yeah, I think that's something else that's really important, that managers sometimes neglect is one-on-one time.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's something that, managers are like, oh, I'm busy, I don't have time, or it's not important, they'll be fine. Um, I think that that's kind of short-sighted. It's important to think to understand, for the employee to understand what their place is in the company in terms of, like, are they doing a good job? Can they communicate issues with their lead? Um, I've had certain leads that would be like, we'd start, weekly one-on-ones and everything's great, and then all of a sudden, all the one-on-ones are gone. It's like, okay, well, it just creates anxiety. It creates stress. Even if you're doing a good job, there's none of that communication with your lead, and you would expect, he's like, oh well, if I work in the same building or in the same company, I'm always going to be talking with them, and that's not always the case. I've never had a lead that is always easy to communicate with. They're always in meetings, or they're always busy, and they're all, they have a very stressful job too. So your ability to kind of schedule time with them, even if they're the person giving you the orders, you don't always have that great communication line with them. So that's another thing, which is like, it's important to kind of realize and work with. Um,
Oh yeah, 100%. Obviously, from the manager's perspective. So when whilst you was at Oculus, you know what specifically did you work on? Was it like the hardware side? Was it shipping titles or some of the built-in apps and experiences? Yeah. Well, what did you work on?
so my role was, I started out as a test analyst, which was working on the hardware itself. So I worked on, um, the Oculus mobile app. I worked on the Oculus Go, and I worked on the Oculus Quest. And um, basically, my role was, um, specifically, it started out just testing the hardware entirely, making sure that the user experience was always good. So working on a live product is particularly challenging because it's just a lot of work. It's a lot of, like, um, because essentially you're doing the same thing every release. And for Oculus, that was every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, we were, doing the same thing over and over again, and it was pretty stressful. So eventually, our team split up um, to do different areas of the work, and we split up the work. And my role became, leading a team focusing on the core operating system side. So my role shifted towards the Oculus Go and the Oculus Quest, and then leading a team that was focused on specifically testing the operating system side. So that basically meant the user interface, um, uh, the Bluetooth capability, the the way that the controllers and the headset updated over the air, um, uh, focusing on telemetry and telemetry data, and making sure that that was all working properly. Um, and basically, it was just kind of creating test cases, assigning out test cases to our team, managing both the team and uh, stakeholders at the company, and then just doing some of the work myself.
Okay. And whilst you worked at Oculus, I mean that was back in what 2018, a few years back now, but
Mhm.
because you had a lot of exposure to the hardware side, did you see any hardware stuff that still hasn't come out yet?
No, I think that the time, the only thing that I saw that didn't come out at the time, I think Quest 1 wasn't released yet, but I remember, um, I remember that towards the end of my time there, um, and then I believe just kind of uh, Quest 2 was in development at that time too, so I was able to kind of see it, but I don't think I ever worked on it if I remember correctly. Um, and then other than that, it's just focusing on what was there. I didn't get to see anything that was, I guess, in development, um, other than those two things.
Okay. And beyond Oculus, then you went to 343 and you worked on Halo Infinite. Was that the single player or was that more the multiplayer that you was working on?
I was working on the single player, so the Halo Infinite has an open world section. Um, uh, Zeta Halo, it's basically a terrain that you go between different dungeon levels through. I think there are some missions that take place in the open world, but that was my prime where I primarily worked was in that open world section.
Okay. And with Halo, how many artists were working on it? Because obviously, such a big game. It's open world. That's open world as well. Is that? I'm trying to think. Is this the first Halo that's open world?
Yes,
It
yes,
is,
this was
isn't it? Yeah.
the first open world Halo game, and honestly, there were countless artists. So we had, um, you know, I couldn't even begin to estimate how many, just because, when you're working on it, at least for a game as massive as Halo, I think this was the only time I was ever confused about how many people worked on the game, because there's just so many people in the office, and they're constantly shifting because of the contracting policy. If you don't know, the contracting policy is you're only able to work there for 18 months, and then you let go. Um, and there's constantly so many people coming and going. The teams are massive, and then there's so many outsourced teams that are in different countries and are constantly talking about their work and submitting their work. It was just unclear, at least on my end, how many artists there were, and I mean, at least with the people that communicated with, there had to be like between 25 and 40 different artists and designers, um, that I could probably name. It's just unlike any other role. It was just so massive. There was so many, cooks in the kitchen, um, all incredibly talented people.
So with the tech industry, especially the gaming industry, there's a lot of contractors as well. Like you say, people. There's just so many people that work on these, titles, and so sometimes there's people are brought in for a specific task, a month, 2 months, 3 months. Just short periods, and they're in, they're out. Almost like mercenaries. And I'm always interested in how much or what sort of percentage that is. How much of a percentage is it like permanent and they're there, until they leave or basically get, fired, and how many are, brought in just for a particular, either task or, project, within Halo for like 3 6 months, like a contractor effectively.
Yeah, Halo was the biggest percentage of contractors to full-time people. I think the full-time people was actually very low compared to how many contractors they brought on.
What, less than
Um,
50%? You
it
want
did
to say?
seem like less than
It
50% were
felt
actually
like that.
full-time. Yeah. But if you want to see, I can't actually show it here, but like if you go to look at the Halo Infinite credits, uh, anybody who was a contractor is basically, it would have their name, and then in parentheses it would have their contracting agency. And if you look
Okay.
at how many percentage, like at least the art department or at least the design department, was so many of them were, at least half of them
External.
were
Yes.
external. We still were integrated into the team, right? We still went into the office. We still worked with people in there. We were a orange badge over a blue badge. The blue badge is the full timers, and the orange badge are the vendors or the contractors. Um, but we were still integrated into the team. It's just, you know, the amount of contractors that were brought onto Halo in Halo Infinite was just insane. More so than any other place that I've worked at. Amazon and Ascendant. It was a very very different experience. Even at Facebook, the amount of contractors compared to the people who were more permanent there, it just felt different. It was insane. Um, and you could see that in the credits too. I mean, I sometimes watch the credits just to kind of, I think it was a great achievement what the team was able to do. Um, and I just kind of watch every once in a while, and there's the amount of people who have those parentheses after their name. Um, it's a lot. So
Oh yeah, and I agree. When I see credits, especially for some video games, and it just keeps going and going. It's like, god damn, that's a lot of people, a
yeah, I
lot of
think Halo
names.
Infinite had 30 minutes of credits. It was
Is
a
that how
lot.
long it was?
I think so.
Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was a kid, I used to every game that I finished, and I finished a lot of games when I was a kid. I would watch the credits from start to finish. I would be there watching the every single name. I'll probably try to read as many of them as as I could. But now that I'm older, I'm just like I either skip it, or if there's a if I'm being honest, or if there's if we can't skip it, I'll just end up doing something else for the 5-10 minutes. But yeah, there are games where I'll come back and I'm like, it's been 10 minutes and the credits are still going, and they're still
Yeah,
only on the
like
programmer section.
yeah, like I enjoy watch I used to always enjoy watching credits like back in the original Halo games. I remember the credits were only like 3 to 5 minutes long, so it was very sit throughable, and I would always love
Yeah,
seeing
30
the
minutes is a bit too
effects.
much.
And then yeah, and then when the length of the credits are like 1/10 of the length of the game or something like that, it's
Yeah,
like, okay, I'll skim through these on YouTube or something like
yeah.
that. It's
Or an
uh,
episode of a comedy show. Like 30 minutes,
yeah,
that's an episode of a comedy show.
exactly. Yeah.
When you put it that way, or half a lunch break at a normal company.
Yeah, I'll spend my
Imagine
lunch
that,
break
having
watching
a
some
lunch break
credits.
and then half of it sitting there watching credits. I mean, yeah, it is
It just
pretty.
kind of goes to show the amount of work that goes into these games. Um, I think a lot of people kind of there's this big narrative about like, oh, some games are built and it's lazy, or they didn't do this, and it's like, no, there's entire like you know entire teams, massive teams that worked on this thing and put it at their all. I think it's one of those things that's like, maybe it didn't come together the way that you hoped, but it doesn't mean that a lot of people didn't put a lot of time and a lot of effort into something. So
Oh yeah, 100%. Because you get you know games all the time. What was that post-apocalyptic one recently? Was it Days After? Is that what it was called? The studio shut down
the day before, yeah,
the day before. Yes, yeah, again, part of it is the fact that there's so much hype around it, and everyone's partly to blame around like that. That a lot of hype gets built because otherwise, if it was just a game that no one really heard about that much, and not a few, but the community wasn't that big and there wasn't that much anticipation, then people would ignore the flaws and be like, "Oh yeah, it's okay. It's okay enough." But because there was such hype, and when you are going against the top tier games, it becomes very very difficult, and a lot of games do suffer from that. They'll have all this hype, same with movies as well. And then but the thing with movies is once it's out, it's out. Yeah, you might get Zack Snyder's Justice League where they improved the after and made it more like his vision, but like that don't happen often. Whereas with games, you can get updates, but
yeah,
sometimes it just destroys the studio. Most of the time it doesn't go the No Man's Sky route where okay, they overpromised, they underdelivered. I still think they did an amazing job on launch, compared in relation to the team size, which was like 10 or 15. Like it was a ridiculously small team size, and what they were able to ship. But they've just constantly been going for the last 8 years or something, and just been doing update after update. And if you've got the PS4 version, you can upgrade that to PS5. You can get all the updates. I don't know anyone else that does that. Most of them just shut down or move on to the next project.
yeah. It's one of those things that I think, um, this it. I don't necessarily know where I stand, but I do know that I don't necessarily agree with the kind of outlook of like, okay, we'll release an early access version of this game and then, fix it later, right? Because I think what happens when you pay for something is that, you know, I think, if I'm working on something, right, and it's like, okay, well, this is something that's mine, it's something that I'm enjoying, but as soon as someone gives me money for it, it's no longer mine, it's now the consumer's, in my opinion. And um, your job is to make sure that that transaction makes them happy, you know. And this idea that you have to wait, you give me money now, in 2 years it will be good, is is not a great place for our industry, honestly, to kind of go into. Um, I think that, for instance, the day before thing, I don't know how that worked. I need to do more research into it. I haven't done much yet, but from the little bit, maybe incorrect. Maybe I shouldn't. I'll just say from the little bit of things that I've heard, it's it seemed like it might have been like misdirection and kind of biting off more than they can chew. Uh, uh, and I think that that's something that I see a lot of, even in big studios, but I do see a lot of smaller studios, and I'm a mentor, for people who reach out to me. I mentor people who want to get into environment art and level design or just game development in general, and the amount of passion that people have is always fantastic. But then the next thing that comes in is scope. I've met so many people who want to make the next big MMO, large scale MMO game, for instance, and it's like, okay, well, who's going to build it? It's like, oh, I'm going to build it. I don't have much experience, but I think I can do it, using Unreal and Quixel, for instance. It's like, oh, and then it's like, yeah, and it's going to be the 16 mile by 16 mile terrain, and there's going to be so much fun things to do. It's like, oh, okay, this is too big of a game. you know you want to scale things based on what you're capable of doing, or else, you know it's going to lead to disaster. And if you're, a hobby developer, there's nothing wrong with disaster, right? It's like, oh, I wanted to make a game, it didn't work out, it doesn't matter. But as soon as somebody pays for it, I think that that gets into some dangerous territory of like,
And pays a lot
there's
of money. Like if you're
yeah,
charged, I think the other thing with No Man's Sky is they never charged the full price. At the time, which was I think probably was $60. It was probably 35, 40. So it was. I think you felt as a result, gamers felt it less. Whereas if they had paid the full price, as they have with many games, like what was that again? That game, a day after,
the day before,
a
the
day
day
before.
before, or something like that.
Yeah, a day before, like that, I'm pretty sure was like the full whack price, and you feel that a lot more. Obviously, if the game's like half the price, pretty much, you're like, okay, you're not expecting almost, in the back of your mind, it to be as good.
Hmm.
So when there is problems day one, you again you don't feel it as much. But yeah, it is a huge problem with developers putting stuff out. Again, I think it depends on the size of the game, price, size of the studio. When it's a big studio with a lot of hype that's been they've been going on for like a year or two. The hype has been pushed around by like the big company, Sony or whoever. Then that can become very problematic. If let's say you're five people, you're putting some vlogs out there on YouTube, you release it, it's not quite there, but you actively work on making it better. I think the community is a lot more forgiving than when it is a big studio, because I think yes, the community can be unfair in terms of paying for the bigger titles, the titles from the bigger IPs or the bigger studios, and be a bit sort of stingy with the smaller studios. But likewise, when the big studios fail or they fall flat on their face, they're a lot more harsh with them. Like
Yeah,
to the point where the studio can just shut down.
yeah. I think that it also kind of depends on the type of people that you're targeting to. Like, who is your target market? Like, if your target market are people who play independent games and want to support independent creators, of course they're going to be a lot more forgiving, because that is, they're more trying to support the studio probably. And if they see effort being put into it and it just kind of was mismanaged, it's like they might be more forgiving for that. But if you have somebody, I think more so than the amount of money that you put in, it's more so the type of gamer that they are. If it's a AAA gamer, for instance, who expects full products at release, they're not going to they'll even tear tear up a independent game if that's kind of the situation. And I think it's to a point it's justified because there's been so many scenarios where you give your hard-earned money, you it's not like it's not like a surgery, right, where it's like, oh, I'm going to accept a half done surgery just because oh, they'll fix it later. I paid for the surgery, and of course the stakes are different. We'll tone down the stakes. Maybe it's a food, right? Maybe it's like I ordered a burger and it's a half done burger. It's like, oh, come back in a year, the rest of the burger will be here all good. It's like, no, I paid for the burger, I want it now type thing. And I think that this comes with the mindset. But of course there's unfortunately a big percentage, or a certain percentage, that attack people, and attack certain people. And it's like, no, no, that's not acceptable. It's okay to be unhappy about a game, but attacking people for the game not being the way you wanted, you know that's different than being disagreeing with a company, right? Going, saying, oh, this company did something that I'm not happy with, in comparison to, oh, this person did something I'm not happy with. There's a big difference with that. There's one scenario in terms of scope, right? And I think something that every, not only independent games but also big games too. This was something that publishers, I believe, kind of fall flat on, is like, you need to scope your game based on your budget and based on your team's ability. And so many times I've seen, both big games and small games taking on more than they can chew. Um, and there's even one example where I did that. When I was getting started, I had a game that I wanted to release for free, and it was like, um, I remember it was a third person shooter, and I was like, yeah, I want this huge third person shooter with some procedural elements and this cool story that had branching storylines. And it was like, yeah, I'm not able to do that because I'm not a programmer, and I'm not somebody who's good at making systems, or even a procedural system for that matter. I don't even know how that works. I'm an environment artist and a level designer. I was like, okay, I spent maybe 5 years working on something that went through iteration after iteration after iteration, until I finally, it got to me. It's like, oh, maybe I should scope this down to something I could actually achieve. And it only turned out to be like a 15-minute walking simulator, but at least I finished it because uh, these grand visions that I had of this huge world and this epic storyline and this cool systems that the player can play through, I wasn't capable of doing because that's not what I'm specialized in. And similarly, there's a lot of people in a lot of studios that kind of go down that similar route, maybe because they want to, maybe because they have to, um, of kind of taking on more than they could kind of achieve with the tech, or that they have. Um, and a lot of time gets spent, oh, we have to catch up, in order to even achieve the game that we have. So it's a very complex problem. It's not always as simple as, oh, just scope down, problem solved. It's also not as simple as, oh, just make the game, it's easy. Unreal can do it, just press this button. uh, there's always a lot more that goes into it. It's just something that I wish was thought out more than I believe it does now.
Yeah, and I think the other, like you said, that companies or individuals, or let's say group of people, will take on more than they're capable of, more than they can chew. And it isn't just a pure, oh, let's throw more resources at it issue. It is experience and exposure as well. Because the reality is, if you give somebody, let's say me, you, or the average person, 250 million dollars to make a movie, a sci-fi movie, we're not producing Star Wars or The Dark Knight. Like, we might get the budget, but we are not producing that movie or anything close to that in any shape or form. Even though we might have the budget to be able to hire people to do it, but it goes beyond that. The thing is, it's the experience of making those types of movies, making movies or making games. Because I think if you look at some of the best franchises and, let's say, trilogies, they usually progressively get bigger. You look at Lord of the Rings. Just from the movie perspective, yes, I know. The books, the battles do get more and more grand, but I feel like the jump from Fellowship to the Two Towers, and then Two Towers to Return of the King, there's huge jumps technically, the storytelling, the scale, everything. And it's because, I think it's truly is because they did Fellowship on a smaller scale. They did it really well. Then they upped it with Two Towers, and obviously the story, allowed them to do that. But then they upped it again for Return of the King as well. And ultimately, each one of them feels amazing. Instead of them saying, "Okay, let's just do Return of the King scale for the first one," or
Yeah.
something like that, crazy over the top. Which I bet they could have done because there was a lot of material missed out from the books and some battles, that were missed out. And again, that's the same with games, especially when a game gets a lot of hype, when it's about to come, a year or two away. Inevitably, you probably get a lot of money they thrown at it. The average person or average company, small or big, isn't going to say no to that. It takes a very strong-willed person to say, "You're potentially going to double my budget, but I don't think I'm capable or we're capable of doing a game that's double the budget relative to, like, if you're bringing my budget up to Halo Infinite level, I don't think I can produce a game that people will say, okay, I would play this instead of Halo Infinite. Whereas, yeah, I could maybe do with 10% extra, and I can leverage that in a way that's meaningful, and my skill set will make it, as effective as possible. But doubling it's just not the best. Most people will say, yeah, I'll take that extra 10 million, 50 million, whatever it is, and I'll work it out. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You end up with games and movies that are just, rubbish. And again, it's not. Again, part of it is, a lot of time developers like to get blamed, uh, but I think it's more lies on the management side than individual developers.
Yeah, like I can't tell you how many times I've been part of a project where it's like, oh, we want to make this kind of game. It's like, okay, and then they hire people who are definitely capable of building that kind of project, but you know, they don't have they don't they don't have um, they don't have the tech ready to go, right? And it's like, oh well, you know, let's say, let's pretend that you're making it your team has been making a bunch of single player like linear games, and then all of a sudden wants to turn it to open world. It's like, okay, well, do you have the tech that can support that kind of thing? um, Most likely no. You have to build that kind of tech. It's not
Yeah.
out of the
Or
box
the
like Unreal.
management structure as well.
Yeah,
I think that's
like
also a
it's
big
not
part.
possible, and like you can throw a bunch of people who have experience making open worlds, but that's not going to help when you need the tech, because otherwise they're like, oh well, I've worked on open worlds before, but I mean, I don't have open world technology here that allows me to do what I could do best. Um, and there's been so many projects I've been part of that it's like, okay, well that's the issue, and usually it leads to delays, or the company realizing, oh well, I'm not able to do something as ambitious as I previously hoped and have to make cuts. Um, Big and small. It's something that affects everybody, I believe.
Oh yeah, like most, people like will want to over promise, and effectively under deliver, not understanding that they've never done that before. They've never organized, a team to do that. It's like, you look at the best studios with the best games, they usually stick within a certain genre or style. You look at, you know, what's it called, Naughty Dog, they're not doing racing games. Like, you're telling me their people aren't technically and artistically capable of making the parts of a racing game? I'm sure the coders can, code the physics for a racing game. They can, code the, whatever it is, and the artist can do 3D models for a racing game. But the reality is, they're probably not beating Need for Speed in the current structure that Naughty Dog is. But how very few people are going to touch Uncharted. Very few people are going to touch The Last of Us. Like that's what they do well. That third person and action. Obviously, Last of Us is a bit more slower paced, and obviously the setting a bit different, but it's still very similar to Uncharted. They didn't go from Uncharted to Call of Duty, like first person, really fast paced, floaty gameplay. They didn't do that. It was still very similar. And then likewise, the Need for Speed teams, if they try and do a action adventure game like Uncharted, we can guarantee they're not going to beat Uncharted. And I think that's the thing. Them not, I think companies not real. And again, it's scale. It's the same thing with scale. If a company was doing a game the quarter of the size of Naughty Dog's, games, but in a similar, genre, but then all of a sudden their budget gets, quadrupled or 5 times, 5x. I still don't think they're gonna beat Naughty Dog at Uncharted and Last of Us, even though they might have done smaller scale ones because they haven't got the experience and scaled up to get there. It takes time, like years, decades even.
Yeah, I agree that I think it's something that is definitely possible, but um, it's not something that could be just move. You're in one game, you're doing one type of game, and then you massively increase scope, and everything's going to work out well. Um, we haven't gotten to that point yet.
No, 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 we have not. So, Halo Infinite, what other two games are the AAA titles? Because the Halo Infinite is one of them. Love Halo Infinite, by the way, and the single player campaign. Halo Infinite for me is is up there with Halo 3 and Halo Reach, which were my favorite Halo games. And if I'm being honest, outside of if you take away nostalgia, Infinite will be my favorite. Again, obviously plays better. I think the graphics are, I think the interesting thing about the graphics with Halo Infinite was they were nicely polished. I don't think they had a Hellblade or Stalker, vibe where there was like, okay, it is so next level. But I felt like everything was just good and polished. That was like I'm very happy with what was produced here, and it's just well made from start to finish. The story, the terrain, the artwork, the menus, the interaction, like every single part of it, especially the single player campaign, was just made so well.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. I think the team did an amazing job in terms of like getting to like the task is monumental, right? Like making a open world game um, for a series that isn't open world, right? How do you get the Halo feel um, that relies on narrative events that happen in a linear fashion? How do you do that in an open world setting? And I think that they did a really good job, and I think it led to a lot of challenges for everyone, but um, I think it came together really well. The other two games that I worked on, AAA, was one of which was New World, which was published by Amazon Games. It was an MMORPG game that takes place. Actually, I don't know the time period it takes place. I forget. But and then the second one was called Immortals of Aveum, that was published by EA and it was published by EA and developed by Ascendant Studios. And that one was
Okay.
a first-person shooter mage game where you play as a magic shooter, basically.
So New World by Amazon, because I know Amazon, did go heavy into the gaming, side of it. I mean, they were heavy into a lot of different industries, but especially gaming. Is New World still active and running, and are they still supporting it? Because I know some stuff they did drop.
Yeah, so New World is one of the few games that they're still they are still updating it up to this day. I've seen. Um, so like right now, if you wanted to play it, it's available on Steam, I believe.
Yeah, and I think Amazon is a great example, and some of the other video game efforts that they made of throwing money at it and then not getting the result of industry veterans. Like Amazon clearly doesn't have an issue of money and resources and getting people in. But again, they're not a video game company, and I feel like that's the reason why Amazon hasn't had that hit where you just like, oh my god, this is the best game ever made. But they're throwing the
Yeah.
money at it as if you know, they're competing with those top tier games.
I think New World did a good job with basically trying to find a niche audience. Like,
Yeah,
I think I don't know what the community is like right now, but I do know that it was poorly received at launch for some things, but for other things, it was really well received. And I think it kind of speaks to like the amazing talent on the team for kind of putting that stuff together. Um, but I think it's one of those games that actually, if I understand correctly, it kind of made one of those turnarounds where, once they started releasing updates in a regular fashion, a lot of people kind of went back to it and was like, oh, this is quite fun. This is quite. I mean, I go back to the game every once in a while because I find it quite relaxing to play. I don't play much of the PvP stuff. I play like as a what do you call, like I craft things, um,
yeah,
an
like
artisan.
explore mode almost, I guess.
Yeah, and it's very relaxing to explore a world that is, you know, with just like a podcast type background. And I get that that's not very exciting for a lot of people. Um, but I think that they kind of made that game for a specific type of of audience, and I think that audience uh, tends to, like it. I'm not aware of how it's going right now, but at least that was my impression of it.
Okay. And the other game that you shipped, the other AAA game, Immortals of Avium,
Mhm.
do you want to talk a little bit more about that, your involvement on that game, and, what type of game is that? And again, is that still something that, because that came out not that long ago?
Yeah, yeah, we released it, must have been almost 6 months ago, maybe 4 or 5 months ago. Yeah, it's basically a game that takes place in a fantasy setting, a fantasy world called Avium, that's kind of on the brink of collapse. There's um, this evil villain named Sandrak who wants to kind of take over magic and take over the world, and you are the last line of defense to stop him. And it's this very simple premise that kind of gets a little bit more complex as the story goes on. It's very lore rich. I still barely understand a lot of the stuff that goes into the lore, but it's quite a deep game in that sense. And my role was to focus on the environment art for one of the levels. It was called Lucium. So there's this one level that's kind of your hub level that you can kind of explore. And as you get more abilities, it's more of a Metroidvania style of level design where you get new abilities, so you unlock different areas of the level with these abilities. And, it introduces more puzzles, more combat encounters, and more things to find, more loot, essentially.
Okay. And what are you working on currently right now? Because Ascendant Studios that made Immortals of Avium, you're no longer there now. So what are you working on now? Where are you based as well?
Yeah, so I'm in the Washington area. I'm not able to say specifically what I'm working on, but I'm still working as an environment artist. I'm still doing contract work that um, for studios that reach out, um, and I in addition to that, I'm also building a game with a team. Our team name is called Pathless Productions, and we're making a game called Sentinel. It's a co-op and party game, a party focused first-person shooter game, and it's built by a lot of a lot of the former developers of Halo and Call of Duty. We essentially came together and we're like, we want to build this party game that has like a shooter game focus. Um, and right now we're currently building the vertical slice. uh, we're still building our team. We're still looking for people to kind of build that team, but that's something that we've been doing on the side. Um, as we kind of look for publishers, and we look for essentially a way to kind of get that game out the door. So that's kind
Okay.
of what I've been doing up to this point.
Okay. So have assumed? No, I'm not assumed. Sorry. Have you always done contracting, and how did you get into contracting, and how does that compare to the the QA days and QA salaries? Because I know what contracting remuneration like. It's another ball game compared to regular perm.
Yeah, it's a little bit different. I mean, I'm kind of I'm hoping that our studio kind of you know is able to launch our game Sentinel, um, and that's kind of what I'm kind of wanting my career path to be. Contracting is more kind of I think it's mostly so that I can kind of keep working, you know keep you know keep paying my bills, and also working on cool new projects. I'm working on uh, you know I'm working on one project for in particular right now that's actually really quite exciting. Um, and I'm hoping to be able to talk about it more in the future. But it definitely is a different ball game. It kind of changes a little bit of. I know that the goal is that you kind of don't you want it to kind of feel like it's a full time role, but it isn't. It you have this thought in the back of your mind that this isn't going to last forever. You have this clock ticking of like, okay, you have till this time before you're not going to have work anymore. So you're always looking for that next thing that you know continues to pay your bills. Um, so it does create a different type of scenario. It is good for certain types of people that don't want to, be stuck at one place forever, or they don't mind not having um, a stable income or a stable job. Um, because there are people that I've met, for instance, who, they would do a contract role, they would work their, work a whole bunch, uh, and then when their contract ended, they would go on a big vacation that would last many months, and then they would find their next role, and they would just do that over and over and over again. Um, I'm kind of someone who's kind of trying to find that next role that I stay at for a long time, whether that's at a studio or if I build that studio with my team. Um, but yeah, I think that depending on who you are, contracting can be quite fun because, you know, even though it can be stressful that, you have that timer going off of like, okay, well, at a point, you're going to run out of money. uh, you need to be able to live. But on top of that, it for a certain type of person, it could be exhilarating because you get to work on many different type of projects. You're never quitting a role, you're always just working on one thing, then your contract ends, you get to work on another thing. um, it's a very different type of lifestyle, and it's fun to kind of get back into that again, kind of be like, oh wow, this is kind of what it's like, work on this project for this many months, work on this project for this many months. um, but yeah, it is a different experience for sure.
Okay. And with your career, you've gone through a lot of companies, a lot of projects. You've obviously shipped three AAA titles, and you're working on some sound like exciting
Mhm.
things now. What advice, and also the fact that you didn't go down the typical academic route, which is always very inspiring and also exciting. I feel like for the listeners out there, because I get people all the time saying, I want to become an artist, I want to become a programmer, I want to get into the the gaming industry, but I don't have a degree.
Mhm.
And to hear somebody that's doing it, done it, and again, your CV is as impressive, if not more impressive, than a lot of people that I know that have degrees and are in the video games industry. Like, I wouldn't see your CV or your experiences and think, yeah, he definitely doesn't have an academic background in art or game art, and that's the reason he's only worked at free for free at Amazon. It's just like, well, he's working at free for free on Amazon. So, what advice and tips and tricks would you give someone listening? And ideally, something that's actionable. Something that's they can really take away.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that I would say a few things, and this is kind of there is some like generic things that I would say, but I think it always really depends on what is it that you want. And I think it's kind of analyzing what is it that you want to do. I've talked with some people who want to get into games as a hobby. I've talked with some people who want it to be a full-time career, and so many things in between. Um, and I think it's to first identify what is your goal, um, and then identifying, the path to that goal. So many people just kind of have this general idea of I want to work on games, and
Yeah,
for instance, and it's like, okay, well, as a job, and then it's like, oh well, yeah, I want it to be a job. It's like, okay, cool, and let's walk through that. um and I get depending on how serious it is and how what the timeline is, it could be as vague or as specific as it needs to be. But let's say, for instance, you want to get a job in games as soon as possible. um, then the next question is, well, what type of role do you want? Do you want to work at a specific type of company? Do you want to work for as a specific type of role? um, and it's I think the next step is identifying what that is. um, so say for instance you want to work for a a game like a studio like 343 doing environment art. uh, let's say well, let's say a studio like 343 doing level design, for instance. um, and then the next step is actually building your portfolio to basically get to that point. um, the most important thing, more than anything, isn't education. It isn't, education has its place. I'm not going to say it's not important, but it has its place. It isn't, it isn't like anything else other than your portfolio. That is the thing that is the most important than anything else. um, so going into there, say for instance you want to work at 343, the next step is to actually build a portfolio that is tailored towards the places that you want to work. um, whether that is spending your extra time building that portfolio, or uh, completely working full time on your portfolio. It is a full time task to basically build a portfolio and apply to jobs. um, so it almost feels like if you're doing if you're in school, or if you're doing a full-time role already, it's almost like a second job at that point because it's so much work. But if that's something that you want to do, setting aside a few hours per week, whatever time that you have spare, um, to do that is super important because it allows you to you know keep building stuff, um, that can fill your portfolio. And then another thing I would say is that when you build your portfolio, have a deadline. Um, I can't tell you how many times I've met people and I've done myself where I basically don't give myself a deadline, and I do something and it lasts forever. Um, you want to give yourself that deadline because it kind of puts a fire under you. It's like, okay, well, it needs to be done during this time. It is a self-imposed deadline, but it allows you to actually finish the project. If you don't put a deadline, projects will last forever because there's always something that you can add that will fix it, right? Or there's always something you could do to make it better. Putting a deadline allows you to kind of um, set goals. And for me, for instance, I had a deadline of like a month, right? So I would do a new project every month. And the way that I structured it is I would do one, 3 weeks of research and actually doing the project, and then 1 week of documentation. And that was the last bit of advice that I would say is document your work. Very, very important, especially in design, but also as an artist. Uh, just releasing a picture of your work or a video of your work isn't enough. You need to be documenting it. Have a game design document if it comes to that. Showcase your materials, showcase your models, anything that you've created. Talk about not only how you made it, but why you made it the way that it is. The why is probably the most important out of all of it. Um, for myself, I had a Medium site, medium.com. It was a website where I basically put some of my work up there. Some of it I took down, but there was like, I think up there still is a Last of Us level that I built and a Halo level that I built. And the way that it worked is I gave myself objectives, I did research, and then I built a level that would fit within that game's universe. And I gave myself 3 weeks to do it and an additional week to document it. Um, and I think kind of going through that route allows you to not only get projects out the door and show it to people, but it also allows you to document it in a way that tells an employer, not only can you do the work, but I can see your thought process. I know what you're thinking. I know how you work. I know that you didn't just get here on accident. I know that you understand how our game works, or how this kind of game works, and you know how to get from point A to point B building content that isn't yours, right? The other thing that I thought was really useful for me, at least, was that I was proving that I could build a level that wasn't in my own narrative. I was building a Halo level because I wanted to prove that I could take Halo's design principles and apply it to my own work, or The Last of Us design principles and put it in my own work, rather than, oh, I invented this game and I invented these mechanics and then I put these levels to kind of make it make sense. Um, Showcasing that you can build something that uh, that's part of the the job, right? It's showcasing that you could build something, whether it's a level or environment or an asset that fits within the universe, an existing universe, and still following the proper principles is super important and super valuable to an employer.
Oh yeah, 100%. Like, basically you're demonstrating how, well you can integrate within an existing team, and most of the time, most jobs that you'll go for, and most companies that you're trying to work for, that's the main thing. Like, how well and quick can you integrate? If you already show, like you said, I've seen some of the stuff that you're doing. Like, I saw the Bioshock thing as well that you posted on LinkedIn. Like, if you're just replicating stuff, again, I feel like people that aren't trying to be businessmen or entrepreneurs, they get it in their head. And even if you're trying to be an entrepreneur and do your own unique thing, but everyone, they get it into their head that what they make has to be unique. No, just grab something, whether it's literally like, okay, there's this piece of art, I'm gonna do make it myself, but I'm actually gonna make it and make it up to that standard, and I'm gonna, like I said, document the process. Written video is also a great form as well. But then,
Hmm.
it's doing that and then like upgrading it, improving it, and then from that you could have your own unique one. Like, if you're a programmer, it might be, okay, I'm gonna get tic-tac-toe, I'm gonna get pong, and I'm gonna make these games where they're robust, they're tested, and they're like unbreakable, like you can't find a fault in it. That's difficult in itself, and that holds a lot of weight versus being like, okay, I need to make some game that's unique and that's my own. And at that point, do you really want to be an employee? Then again, intermediary, you might be an employee so you can pay the bills. Fair enough. And you also, even if you do want to be an entrepreneur, it's still good to be able to say, okay, I've cloned 4 games. I've done it from scratch. You'll learn a shit ton doing it. Instead of saying, I just want to make this game that I've got in my head really big. Plus, when you're cloning something, how it needs to feel and look at the end. You can say, okay, this is not the same as the thing that I'm cloning, and therefore I have not achieved it yet. Whereas if you're making your own thing, you don't know if it's really good or bad, or you've achieved what you want to achieve, because you don't have a proper thing to compare it against.
Yeah.
Whereas if you make a Pong game, you can play Pong online, comparing. Okay, this is 95% of the way there. Let's call that a success. Versus, okay, this is rubbish compared to it. This doesn't feel like it at all. Something's wrong.
Yeah, I think you brought up some two interesting points. One of which is, the making your own game thing. Making your own game is very hard, and you're not going to be doing things that are particularly useful in terms of a um, workplace scenario, right? So I know some people who've been working on a game, and they're doing everything, right? They're doing characters, they're doing environments, they're doing design, they're doing systems, they're doing programming, when all they want to be is, for instance, a level designer. It's like, well, then why are you doing everything, right? There's so much things that go into making a game that level design is like 5% of all the work that you're doing. If you're wanting to make a game that, you just want to make a game, that's one thing. But if your objective is to be a level designer at a company, and you're spending 95% of your time not doing level design, then that is challenging, right? It's difficult, which is why like games like Halo Infinite, right, having a forge mode, you know, forge mode has its limitations and I have some issues with it sometimes, but one of its biggest strengths is it allows you to do level design, for instance, without needing you already have a game built into it. So as long as you study the mechanics, figure out what makes a good level in Halo Infinite, you know, and you study that and then you build a level using Halo Infinite's tools, yeah, you might not be able to make, you might not be proving that you can do, you know, uh, let's say, certain types of design, mechanical design, or you might not be proving that you could do programming, but at least you prove that you could do level design, right? Because you're using Halo's existing mechanics to build a level. And as long as you study what makes a good level in Halo, Halo Infinite in particular, and you build a level using those tools, you could basically, you're essentially doing the job of a level designer. Um, and that can help you build out your portfolio. And I've seen a lot of people who do like recreations, right, as a portfolio. Recreations are a good way to kind of learn, but I think, when you're, as you were saying, cloning something, what matters most is that you understand the intent, right? Because you don't want to necessarily copy something because it's like, okay, well, everybody can kind of copy something. What you want to do is showcase that you can, copy the principles, copy the objectives, copy what makes a game the game, right? So like for instance, in my Bioshock project that you brought up, my objective was to figure out, okay, well, what makes Bioshock look like Bioshock? What makes Bioshock, those scenes, what makes them feel evocative and interesting? And then I took the actual locations. So one of them is Arcadia. Arcadia is this forest underwater. Um, and I was like, okay, well, I got some shots from the game that made me kind of understand the vibe that I'm trying to go for, um, and the general artistic principles. But then it was to figure out, okay, well, what makes Bioshock Bioshock? What are the different artistic principles that the game had that I could modernize? And then I made a new version of Arcadia that fit my own principles and Bioshock principles, merged them together to create a whole different layout and a whole different scene that you never see in the game, but you could tell it's Arcadia, right? Because you know the my goal was to just make a scene that made it feel like it's Bioshock, even though it's not a copy, it's my own creation. Um, and that's kind of what my outlook is for even portfolio pieces where I'm using games as a reference. When I built my Halo level, um, a bit fun fact: the Halo level that's on my Medium article is actually what got me hired at 343. When I built it, I was using the Silent Cartographer. I played a bunch of Silent Cartographer, and then I was like, okay, well, how can I make my own level that fits these same design principles? And then I built my own narrative that fit within that structure. It's like, okay, well, what if you weren't trying to you know, unlock the key to the control room where you could see the map of the ring? What if my objective was to get into the side of the Halo ring, right? The mechanical side. And I was like, oh, what if it's guarded by these two towers that you have to disable? And then each time you disabled one of the towers, new events would happen that would cause, either more enemies to spawn or, some sort of narrative event that led to this very climactic showdown at the end. Um, and then I built it, and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to spend a few weeks building it. I built it, I documented it, and that is essentially what you know the lead level designer saw it at 343 and was like, you know let's interview this guy. And that's how I got my first, you know that's how I got the role at 343 after building a lot of different portfolio pieces for a lot of different companies. That's the one that ended up sticking the first time.
Okay, I mean, yeah, I think that's just some great advice. Being able to break things down like Bioshock. Love those games 1, 2, and then Bioshock was it Infinite? It was Bioshock Infinite? It was called Bioshock Infinite, wasn't it? The third one.
Yes, I believe
Yeah,
Bioshock Infinite. Yeah.
yeah, like Halo Infinite. For a moment, I was like Halo Infinite. Bioshock wasn't called Infinite. Yeah,
A
the
lot of games call it Infinite now.
yes,
That's the new thing.
it feels like it. But yeah, that was an amazing game. before we wrap up the podcast, one, I want to say thank you for coming on, but two, I also do a set of fun rapid fire quick questions. Are you ready for them, Caleb?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so
I don't know
first,
what to expect. Let's see.
yeah, so would you rather have $5 million upfront, or half a million a year for the rest of your life, and why?
um, I think I would ask for $5 million up front because I would like to start a business with it. I want to start a game studio. And if I had the ability to start a game studio, I feel like I could grow that studio in a way that would be able to sustain me for the rest of my life. So I got a lot of ideas that I'm building up towards. So if I had an opportunity to get $5 million and start a studio, I would definitely take it.
Okay, fair enough. And what's your favorite video game, movie, and board game?
My favorite movie would probably be, oh no, I'd probably say Inception, just because um, in Inception the story is about like building dreams a little bit, and that's very much my dream, is to be able to build worlds. And I think that's the closest I've seen a game to being like a level designer or environment artist. Uh, so it's just basically just architecting your own dream. You get to be architecting levels in games. My favorite game is I'd have to say Halo. I would say Bioshock, but Halo, I think, as an all-around game, is just exciting and fun, and it is the game that made me want to be in game design in general. It's the Forge mode excited me to the point that I wanted to kind of keep building things. So even from Halo 3, that's kind of what grabbed me. Um, Even though Bioshock was more exciting for me from a story perspective and a game design perspective. And then board game, I'd say, is Catan, Settlers of Catan. That game, I think, has a very simple set of mechanics that altogether create this very complex interplay between yourself and all the other players, and it's infinitely replayable because every time you play the game, even though the same things happen, unique things occur that you don't expect, right? Like, oh, this one resource is more scarce than the other. I should have thought of that. It's not the same thing every time, even though it's just a bunch of smaller, simpler mechanics put together. Um, Also, it makes me not be happy with my friends when they traitor me.
Mhm. Okay, what video game are you looking forward to?
um, I don't think I know of a game that I'm looking forward to. Maybe Hellblade, the second
Yeah,
one, but
I just want to see the graphics like in person. But yes, the
the
game as
first
well.
one the first one was really exciting, but the or not exciting in that sense, but it was interesting because the way that it told its story. But I
Yeah,
don't think I'm very like pumped to play it. It's more so that I really want to see where the story goes.
yeah,
What more so, I'm more excited to. I think it actually just came out. I have to download it and play it. Was Helldivers 2. Um, just
yes, it
because
does
it
come out.
seems like a very exciting game. It seems like a game that doesn't take itself seriously. It's just fun for the sake of fun. And it's very much the kind of game that I want to make in the future, is to create fun games that are party focused with your friends, that doesn't necessarily take itself too seriously. And I think that this game is the closest in a while that I've seen a shooter go. There's games like the Phasmophobia, and there's games like Lethal Company that have that party setting, but it's not like, it isn't a shooter, right? I want a shooter that does those kinds of things, and I think Helldivers 2 is probably the closest I've seen in a while. So I'm excited to give that game a play.
Okay, and final question, two-parter: does money buy you happiness, and what does a good life mean to you?
Uh, I don't believe that money buys you happiness, but I think that money buys you calm that can give you happiness. I think people who say, "Oh, money gives you happiness," is not necessarily correct. I think money can solve a lot of problems that can make somebody unhappy. Um, struggling to survive for money or struggling to put enough food on the table are definitely things that can make you unhappy. Um, and I think that all that money does is give you more room to be happy, um, even though it's not necessarily required. Something that I require for my happiness is um, freedom to be creative and to try things like that are creatively fulfilling and technically difficult. Um, I love working on as an environment artist. That is what I do. If it makes me creatively fulfilled, but it's not enough for me. Is also what makes me happy is being technically challenged. Uh, working with new software that no one knows how it works yet, or experimenting with a new feature in a software that I love, or being tasked to do something that I know is going to be challenging and finding creative ways to solve that problem. Those are the things that I think make me happy. Uh, from a professional point of view, I have things that make me happy from a personal point of view, but I think that I could go all day in terms of. I think all I need really is you know friends to be around and allow me to kind of be myself and have fun with.
Okay, a nice way to wrap it up. I just want to thank you, Caleb, for coming onto the podcast. Thank you for taking the time. It was a great one, and I'm sure a lot of people were inspired by your journey and your story as well.
And thank you so much for having me. It's definitely been a fun time. Thank you.
No problem. And thanks for everyone that tuned into this week's episode of FireDEV. I'll see you all in next week's episode. Bye bye.